Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to bring you my May wrap-up. Now this wrap-up is most likely going to be shorter than my previous ones because, simply put, I did not read as much. May was a very busy but also a very energy-draining month for me for so many reasons, and unsurprisingly that had an impact on how much information I was able to process. I'm definitely not ashamed of what I am or am not able to read, but as a planner it was a bit of a bummer because I had all these books I wanted to read, especially for the Asian Readathon, that I just didn't get to. But again, I'm not going to feel bad about it because I know the kind of reader I am, and I know that reading AAPI books especially does not come with an expiration date. All of that to say, I read less books this month and I'm not going to shame myself for that. I picked up a few things for the Asian Readathon, I read a couple of arcs as well, so let's just get into it. The first book I finished in May was my arc of Man-O-War by Corey McCarthy. This just recently came out on May 31st from Penguin Teen, but I was kindly sent a review copy by the author himself. This is a queer YA contemporary story about River, who's an Arab-American transgender teen and competitive swimmer. One day when their class takes a field trip to the local marine life park, River literally finds themselves in the shark tank. They're rescued by one of the employees who turns out to be this aggressively unapologetic, out and proud young person who River ends up falling for and who has a tremendous impact on their self-discovery process. This whole experience ends up forcing River to finally confront and name their own internalized transphobia and gender dysphoria and discover who they truly want to become. Content warnings for some experienced homophobia and transphobia, both internal and external, depictions of gender dysphoria, references to toxic diet culture, some emotional abuse, instances of sexual harassment, some references to past self-harm, allusions to past experiences of racism and xenophobia, some descriptions of depressive episodes, and some sexual content. I enjoyed this. Going off the synopsis, which is pretty vague, I had absolutely no idea what to expect. But this story has such an incredibly strong narrative voice, it has a really distinctive humor that effectively cuts through the tension and the more serious moments, and it's still super engaging even though it could technically be described as being plotless. And that's actually what I appreciate most about this story, the fact that it's an entire book dedicated to the journey of transition. And transition is not an experience that mimics traditional narrative structure. There's no direct connection between point A and point B, especially when there's no set points in the first place, and the story of the process comes from the process itself. What I mean by that is that transition is not a linear process, and it's also not a universal process. It is completely and inherently different depending on the individual in question, and this story is not about what it means to transition, but what it means for River to transition. Cis people especially have absolutely no baseline for what the transition process feels like or looks like, and this story isn't about that either, but it is about challenging that idea of what most cis people think transition means. There's this pervasive idea, especially among cis folks, that to be properly trans you have to realize it when you're very young, realize it because you hate yourself or hate some part of yourself, then in a very blurry montage of events you somehow get on hormones, have surgeries, change your name and pronouns, and find instant happiness. That may very well be some people's experience, and more power to them, but the pervasiveness of that idea is categorically false and a gross oversimplification of what so many trans people face, and to uphold that narrative is to erase the nuances of so many trans people's experiences. Man-O-War is a story that happily shatters those conventions because for most of the story, River is lost and confused. They oscillate between labels and language, changes to their presentation and how they identify, because they're not in a place mentally, emotionally, or in terms of safety where they can truly process their transness. This story honors the fact that coming into your transness doesn't have to happen all at once, and in fact for most people it doesn't, and also that the experience of transness is not lessened just because we may not instantly have all the perfect answers to some very deeply complex questions. It's so important to see a character like River who does not have access to certain language, ideas, or experiences that many people consider to be essential to the trans experience, to see them painstakingly unlearning their own isms and phobias and gradually figuring themselves out, all while making mistakes. There is no perfect way to be trans, and I feel like this story definitely encapsulates that, while also acknowledging that sometimes there are parts of ourselves that seem so scary or unknowable that we let them sink down deep inside of us until we're fully ready to bring them to the surface. In so many ways, Man-O-War is about River's journey towards that readiness. Their story and their relationships don't always follow a direct path. There are imperfections and regressions and so many complicated questions, but by the end they are exactly who and where they are meant to be. And I think that's why everything connects back to the shark tank, because the shark tank is a symbol of captivity, of being trapped in a very unnatural way in a place that you're not supposed to be. And the story is about the people and experiences that pull River out of that and allow them to find where they truly thrive. Like I said, I enjoyed this so much. It's definitely challenging and chaotic at times, but I think it also has the potential to be a very life-saving, life-affirming book for so many folks. I gave this 4.5 stars. After that, I picked up my arc of Beauty and the Beisharam by Lily Vale, which also recently came out on May 24th from Penguin Teen. This is a really fun, summery YA contemporary romance. It's rivals to lovers, and the main character, Kavya, is a super accomplished, driven overachiever when it comes to academics and really everything in life, and she cannot stand her nemesis Ian, who always seems to be one-upping her in class. In a truly nightmarish scenario at an end-of-the-year party, Ian ends up witnessing Kav's very public, very embarrassing breakup with her ex. So she decides to lay low for the summer and just focus on working for this Party Princess entertainment company, but her plans are ruined when she realizes that she's been cast as the Ariel to Ian's Prince Eric. Now they find themselves not only as co-workers, but playing pretend as this fairy tale couple for children's parties. And if that wasn't enough, their friends are also sick and tired of them always competing with each other, and they devise a series of challenges that will take place over the entire summer to finally decide who is the best of the best. Content warnings for mentions of a past partner's infidelity, some experience with colorism, some brief references to anxiety and anxiety attacks, and some exploration of child death and grief. Before I run away with my thoughts, I did want to mention that this book is actually a queer romance because Kav very subtly mentions being attracted to people of multiple genders. It's also worth noting that her older sister Simran is also very queer and canonically bisexual and demi-romantic. Like, those words are on the page. This book very quickly became one of my favorite YA romances. It centers a really sweet, tender endgame relationship that will make you feel all the things, and in terms of fun summer shenanigans, it has pretty much everything but the kitchen sink. I have to start by talking about the main character, Kavya, who's just incredible. She is strong, decisive, driven, talented, intelligent, competitive, and absolutely fearless in her pursuit of greatness. Even when people look down on her for being too ambitious or quote-unquote overly confident, she does not care. She does not intend to change or make herself smaller just because other people think that she should. The word Beisharam in the title is a Hindi word that translates to shameless, and there's a negative connotation to it that has followed Kav all throughout her life, especially in her family and her community, where it's believed that Indian women especially should not be outspoken about taking pride in themselves or their accomplishments. Even people who wouldn't know that precise word still feel that way about her, and that moniker is meant to discourage her from expressing the fullness of herself simply because for other people it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. That is exactly why the rivals to lovers dynamic works so incredibly well in this story, because Ian respects and sees Kav for exactly who she is. Because in order to be considered someone's rival, you have to be considered their equal first. Oftentimes that sense of rivalry stems from one person actually fearing that the other person is better than them in some specific quantifiable way. So if Ian considers Kav to be his rival, that establishes a baseline of mutual understanding and respect. That means from page 1, Ian respects everything Kav is bringing to the table, and in fact he challenges her to be better and to be even more unapologetic, fearless, and accomplished than she already is. So not only is that sense of competition something that encourages and enables both characters to grow, but it highlights the fact that Ian doesn't think that Kavya should change anything about herself. And that relates to something else I love so much about this story, which is that it's not about people trying to make Kav change. Usually when you have such a strong, decisive, headstrong female character, especially a female character of color, often the story is about bringing them down a few pegs, and this book is very much not about that. That's not to say that Kav doesn't have things to learn or unlearn about herself, or that she doesn't have room to grow. She definitely does, especially in terms of realizing that her dynamic with Ian is not about winning, but rather about a mutual exchange of affection and trust. But no one in Kav's life, not her parents, her friends, her sibling, or Ian, is expecting her to minimize herself or make herself less. And in fact, the entire story is an affirmation of how she deserves to take up space. To circle back to the fullness of Kav's character, I have to say it's very rare that we get to have stories about young people who are allowed to express all the different parts of themselves. The title, for example, is a clear reference to Beauty and the Beast, which creates a dichotomy of character where one person in the relationship represents the beauty and the other one represents the beast. But this story allows Kav to be both the beauty and the Beisharam, to learn that both of these things can be true at once and can also be badges of honor that one wears with pride, and that there can be beauty and strength in being shameless. After all, if you know exactly who you are and you're trying to be the best person you can be, why should that ever make you feel ashamed in the first place? This book is fun, exciting, entertaining, romantic, and it brought such a huge smile to my face. If you're a fan of romance, I cannot recommend this one highly enough. I gave it 4.5 stars. Then for my library library, I listened to The Cartographers by Peng Shepherd, read by Emily Wu Zeller, Nancy Wu, Ron Butler, Neil Helligers, Jason Culp, Brittany Presley, and Karen Chilton. This is a really interesting blend of contemporary fiction, mystery, and some light fantasy elements. The story follows Nell Young, whose parents were both very highly esteemed cartographers, and she's also working in the same field with an internship at the New York Public Library. But everything changes when she finds what she thinks is just a worthless gas station map in the library archives. When she shows the map to her father and tells him that she intends to add it to the official collection, he goes absolutely ballistic, to the point of insisting that she gets fired and then proceeding to blackball her name throughout the entire industry. And from that moment on, what was left of their family was torn apart. Years and years later, Nell's father is found dead in his office with no explanation, except that very same map that ruined their relationship has been hidden in his desk. Once Nell starts looking into it, she discovers that this map is much more valuable and rare than she ever could have thought, but for some very surprising reasons, and as soon as people realize that she has it, they begin to hunt her down with the intention of taking it by force. Content warnings for parental death, grief, and fire-related trauma, family estrangement, some references to past infidelity, and some instances of violence and gun violence. This book really took me by surprise in a good way because it was not what I expected in any sense. The magnetic pull of the mystery element is pretty much instantaneous. You're dumped right into this mysterious murder layered on top of this very fraught family history, and it just makes you want to know what's gonna happen next. For me, that was one of the greatest strengths of the story, the way the plot and the questions just organically build on themselves to a breaking point and really bring along some interesting and fascinating twists. I hesitate to classify this book as what I'm gonna say next because this subgenre of sorts comes with a very specific set of expectations, but there's almost an element of dark academia at play within this story's flashbacks. Those chapters focus on this group of college students, including Nell's parents, who sort of accidentally form their own secret society and who are harboring a potentially terrible secret that was created because of their insatiable ambition that has very severe consequences. Again, that's not the entirety of the story, but the flashbacks definitely have that vibe for me, and you're sort of slowly witnessing that friend group tear itself apart because of this secret. So that also makes the story really interesting, and there's also that surprising bit of fantasy or magic that I won't really get into that also keeps the reader on their toes. I was fully invested in this mystery from the very first page, and considering the fact that this story is largely about maps, I think that's really a testament to the author's ability to tell a compelling story. Speaking of maps, I think one thing this story does most successfully is explore maps as a fascinating intersection between geography, math, art, and science. It might seem silly to say, but I've never really thought about the artistic piece in the map making process, which should be obvious since maps have to be designed and drawn, and obviously there's limitations to that because they're meant to represent specific places with accuracy, but there's a really interesting interplay of disciplines at work. Through the metaphor of maps, there's also these really interesting philosophical questions about how we understand and define the existence of the world around us. Do we make the world real by documenting it, or is the act of documentation proof enough that there is something real to observe in the first place? Another compelling part of this story is how we often talk about breaking cycles of violence, and the mystery in this story is actually affording Nell the space to break her family's cycle of silence, which is another form of violence, and also secrecy. There are so many things her father was too afraid to tell her, especially after her mother died, that she's now having to find out for herself. And having the agency to uncover those answers, no matter how difficult it may be, is actually quite powerful. In unearthing those answers, Nell might actually find a way to heal from her family's trauma, and I think that's a big part of what makes that mystery element work. I don't know if this is going to resonate for anyone, but I think this book is perfect for fans of Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloan. That is a backlist title that's all about academia, secret societies, mysteries, and the surprising intersections between technology, analog materials, and perhaps something more unquantifiably mysterious. Anyways, overall, I quite enjoyed this. I couldn't give it a full 5 stars because there was a romantic element that felt kind of random, a few plot holes, and also the plot sort of plateaus at the very end with a bunch of monologues and exposition that didn't quite land. So the execution of the climax for me was not quite there, but with that aside, I still think this was fantastic and absolutely original, so I gave it 4 stars. Then I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, which was The Girl and the Ghost by Hannah Alkoff, and I listened to the audiobook through my library, which was read by Marai Booth Ong. This is a dark, middle-grade contemporary fantasy story that follows a young Muslim Malaysian girl named Soraya, whose grandmother was a witch, and because she recently passed away, her Pelisit, which is a companion ghost of sorts, needs to find someone of the same bloodline to be his new host. He comes upon Soraya and decides to become her companion, which she welcomes because she is experiencing a lot of loneliness. But she doesn't realize that Pelicets have a dark side to them as well, and when hers begins succumbing to his wicked nature, Soraya must find enough light for them to survive before they're both lost to darkness. Content warnings for death of a grandparent, familial estrangement, emotionally distant parent, bullying and off-page instances of physical assault, descriptions of bugs and other mild body horror, and some non-graphic references to vomit. I also enjoyed this one so much. It's a very fun, whimsical, emotional middle grade story that feels very much like a modern-day fairy tale or folk tale. It definitely borrows from that sort of tradition to tell a heartfelt and heart-wrenching story about a girl and her companion ghost. What I really appreciate about this story is how it highlights that friendship is not always easy. In fact, Soraya's relationship with her Pelicet named Pink actually starts off being very fraught and toxic just because they both have two very different natures. They were taught how to show their love and their value in very different ways, and that's not always conducive to a healthy dynamic. As a Pelicet, Pink has been conditioned to do his master's bidding and prove his own worth by using his powers of darkness to sow chaos, and so when he wants to protect Soraya, that's his first instinct. Soraya, on the other hand, is a much more quiet personality. She's someone who seeks peace and mutual understanding and shows affection for people around her by being there for them and helping them. So again, the way they express affection is very different. There definitely reaches a breaking point where Soraya is becoming scared by those glimpses of Pink's darkness, and she has to draw a line and tell him that he needs to honor her nature as well, or else they can't be connected, they can't be friends. And once they start working together based on the same expectations, their dynamic dramatically shifts. I definitely enjoyed listening to this one. I think it asks some really interesting questions about whether two vastly different creatures can coexist in a way that's happy and mutually beneficial, and it takes you on an exciting adventure full of magic, darkness, and chaos in order to find those answers. Not gonna lie, I'm still processing this one in real time. I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna settle on for my rating, but I'm gonna predict around 4.5 stars. And the last book I was able to finish for the month was my arc of The Fae Keeper by H.E. Edgman. This just came out as well on May 31st. I was kindly sent a digital arc by H.E. Edgman and also an early finished copy by Inkyard Press. This is the sequel and I believe conclusion to the Witch King duology. To avoid spoilers, I'm just going to focus on the synopsis for the first book. It's about a trans witch named Wyatt who was born into this fairy world where fairies and witches are very starkly divided, and in fact witches are openly persecuted in that world. So he fought his way out of that place and made it to the human world with no intention of looking back. However, as a child, he was betrothed to the Fae Prince, Amir, who's actually tracked Wyatt down in the human world because the throne has come under attack, and he claims that their marriage would officially secure his place as king. So Wyatt begrudgingly returns to the fairy world, and once he's there, not only does he realize that he might still be in love with Amir, but he's also faced with the fact that he might be able to finally secure freedom for his fellow witches. Content warnings for murder and violence, some gore and body horror, on-page descriptions of panic attacks and dissociation, graphic discussions of infanticide and cannibalism, off-page instances of rape and assault, discussions of childhood sexual abuse, some animal death, explorations of dysphoria, racism, and transphobia, and some fade to black sexual content. Also, before I get into it, H.E. Edgman is queer, trans, and indigenous, Amir is demisexual, Briar, I believe, is bisexual and ace, and Wyatt is, of course, very gay and very trans. It is no secret that The Witch King is one of my favorite books. I've shouted up and down the internet about how much I love this story that honors the power, necessity, and sacredness of trans rage, while also being the dark, anti-fascist fantasy romance of my dreams. Like, the first book is literally about dismantling the fantasy police, decentralizing unjustly accrued sources of power, fighting for environmental justice, and abolishing systems of oppression, all on top of a kick-ass romance. What else do I possibly have to say? The Fae Keeper is such an incredible continuation of that story. I can't say too much about the plot, so I won't, but I love the continuation of Wyatt's character growth and how this installment continues to interrogate his complicated relationship with anger, alienation, trauma, and loss. One of the most compelling parts of this story is how Wyatt is continuing to come into his powers as a witch, because that's something he was denied growing up, not only because witches are actively oppressed in this world, but because the survival of that knowledge is very scarce. In that way, there's a sense of healing and catharsis that comes with Wyatt forging his own path and his own connection with that magic, because it draws on the knowledge of the past, but also makes space for his own understanding of that magic on his own terms. In that way, the story shows how the past and the present are symbiotic forces happening simultaneously. When it comes to marginalized communities especially, so much of what we know and what we do is inherently because of those who came before us, who created the foundation or the blueprint, but who also fought to give us a chance to make something new for ourselves. That's a really essential piece that most of us forget. I also really appreciate the continued commentary on the value of anger and rage. At the beginning of this story, Wyatt is actively trying to make himself a quote-unquote better person, which means tamping down his instincts to attack other people and basically playing nice. But over time, he begins to question why so many people are quick to label anger as being useless. Especially because his emotions and his rage are connected to his magic, initially he feels like anger is just a conduit for destruction, which is not outwardly helpful or beneficial in many situations. But eventually he realizes that his anger has protected him and those he loves in so many ways, and that sometimes things need to be destroyed in order for them to be reimagined and rebuilt. With that understanding, how could his anger ever be diminished to being less than or being useless? There's also so much nuanced exploration of relationship dynamics in this book that just make me want to scream from the top of my lungs because yes. I cannot emphasize enough how much I love the relationship between Amir and Wyatt, and this installment really shows us how Wyatt is questioning where they draw the line between magical bond, mutual affection, and shared trauma, and whether there's a definite distinction between those things in the first place. His friendship with Briar is also just incredible and complex because there's such a deep sense of intimacy and trust between them, and they're reaching an interesting point in their friendship where they're moving from depending on each other to survive to actively choosing to have each other in their lives. There's a deep sense of vulnerability that comes with that shift, especially for Wyatt, who has trouble seeing himself as someone who is worthy and deserving of love, or someone who can be chosen by other people, especially after his many years of trauma and being hated for being a witch. But especially when you consider the dynamic of this evolving friendship and how it parallels with what's happening with Amir and how they're trying to distinguish where magical bond and mutual affection begins and ends, it's very clear that the ability and agency to make those distinctions is what makes it such a powerful choice. I just really appreciate how this is a fantasy story that continues to ask the really hard questions about how we concretely dismantle oppressive systems and redistribute power equally, and how do we go about meaningfully making amends and change. These two books do all the things I just discussed and so much more, while also simultaneously being badass and making space for vulnerability and tenderness, but also showcasing this absolutely perfect comedic timing with all of Wyatt's little asides and trashy takes. That voice makes it feel relatable, and it's allowing the story to show itself as having a world that has immense gravity, but also doesn't take itself super seriously, which makes it more accessible, in my opinion, for its target audience. I have nothing but good things to say about the Fae Keeper and H.E. Edgman. They have just further solidified themselves as an auto-read author, and I am so excited about whatever they write next. I know it's going to be fantastic. Please read The Witch King. Please read The Fae Keeper. I gave this another 5 stars. So those are the 5 books I was able to read this month. I'm not going to put any grand expectations on June. Hopefully it's better, of course, but only time will tell, and I will continue to give myself grace. With that said, if you have thoughts on any of these books, or if you plan to read any of them yourself, I would love to hear all about it down below in the comments. But that's everything I had for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.